today we are delighted to be joined by Alan MacLeod, an academic, researcher and investigative journalist who writes for MintPress News, as well as contributing to media analysis and political commentary on numerous podcasts and publications. Welcome to Cuba Analysis. So I'm going to go straight into it, Alan. In 2018, you published Bad News from Venezuela, 20 Years of Fake News and Misreporting, a book based on your PhD thesis, which was undertaken at the University of Glasgow. So I've kind of got two questions on that. What led you to investigate the mainstream media coverage of Venezuela? And what were the main characteristics of fake news and misreporting that you analysed over the 2 decades of the Bolivarian government revolution?
Yeah, I guess they're kind of quite similar questions in a way. The reason I was so interested in it was, let's go back to 2008. There's the financial crisis happening. It felt like our system of economics was falling apart. And people were looking around for alternatives. And one of the most prominent alternatives that was going on at the time was the experiment in Venezuela. And I got interested in having a look at it. And very quickly, I saw that there was huge disagreements in what was actually going on. I was reading some academics, which were highly credible, that was saying that this was an extraordinary leap forward in democracy. Human rights and people's quality of life were drastically improving. And yet, if you turn to the pages of large newspapers in this country, you'll be presented with a completely different understanding of it, that this is a dictatorship, a modern nightmare, a government that is throwing the country into total ruin. And so I got very interested in trying to actually understand what was going on there, because, there's basically two completely conflicting understandings of what's going on. And it soon became clear that if one side was true, that meant that there was an awful lot of academics, or rather, there was an awful lot of newspaper outlets that were publishing totally fake news, ridiculous misreporting about the country. But if the other side was true, then that would mean there was an even greater conspiracy going on between some of the world's greatest academics, the United Nations, the World Bank, the IMF, that were all publishing these reports saying there were actually huge leaps forward in terms of the quality of life for ordinary Venezuelans. So my PhD was basically an attempt to get to the bottom of what was actually going on, because I found it a really interesting question. And what I found, I eventually published into a book called Bad News from Venezuela, 20 Years of Fake News and Misreporting. And what I found was basically that the media in the United States and United Kingdom present minority views of an extremely contentious topic as uncontested facts, while completely ignoring or downplaying any positive news about the country. They often just completely invent negative events out of whole cloth. They present facts about the Bolivarian Revolution as accusations in the mouths of people that they have been bad-mouthing and undermining for 2 decades. And I also found that there was very little difference in tone and quality of the coverage between left and right newspapers. So in the United States, we saw the New York Times and Washington Post published basically the same sort of articles as the Miami Herald. And then the UK, the gamut went from the Guardian to the Telegraph. But honestly, if you changed the header on most of these articles, you wouldn't be able to tell which one is which. The main reasons for this were, number one, the UK and US governments are actively trying to overthrow the government of Venezuela. They don't like socialism. They don't like Hugo Chavez or now Nicolas Maduro or anything that's been going on in Venezuela. But there are also some more interesting journalistic reasons for this. Journalists tend to come from the upper classes of society, and when they do go to Venezuela at all, they're usually parachuted in. Usually they don't speak Spanish. They stay in the wealthy eastern side of Caracas at fancy hotels. They meet, if they meet anyone, they meet a couple of pre-arranged sources, which have often been arranged by the British or American embassies. And the small amount of journalists who work in the English language covering Venezuela almost all live in this bubble in eastern Caracas. They live in extremely wealthy areas like Chacao, where they are very often live on compounds, gated communities replete with armed guards. They go around in chauffeured cars or taxis, and they interact very little with the large majority of people who live in very different circumstances to the jet set international elite who basically make up their community. Part of my PhD was to actually interview a lot of the journalists that cover the work on that cover Venezuela for the Western press, and there's really not that many of them. So I was able to talk to pretty much most of them, and what I found was that they are openly ideological in their outlook. They describe themselves to me, a reporter that said that I was going to be publishing this, as quote unquote the resistance, end quote, to Chavez, that they saw themselves as the ideological foot soldiers in a war of democracy against authoritarianism. And they were not above practicing what they called sexy tricks, which is another new word for fake news. One journalist I spoke to, I can say his name, I published it, his name is Anatoly Kurmanayev. He told me that he intentionally plants fake news or wildly distorted stories into the press, and he does this because he's a quote-unquote mercenary, end quote, for hire. One example of this was a ridiculous story that went around, got published all around the world, talking about how Venezuela is such a nightmare, the economy is so screwed. Look at this, condoms actually cost $850 in the US, in Venezuela. Now, that story was completely untrue. The reality was that a box of condoms actually cost $8, so pretty much the same as most countries. But that article, that idea got picked up all around the world, and Venezuela was able to be presented as this, isn't this tin pot dictatorship, countries going to the dogs, etc., etc. And he was completely unrepentant about it. He said, this is important work. We want to, get people to click on our links so that we can tell them more about the failing government, etc. This is the sort of work relationship people have when they are covering Venezuela. People generally aren't sent there who are not already ideologically on board with the US government project, which is supported by the UK government. But a few of the journalists I did speak to were very critical of the coverage. And they told me that they openly had to practice self-censorship because the newsroom was so overwhelmingly reactionary. And one of the reasons for that was that very often Western companies will hire local Venezuelan journalists from the far-right opposition newspapers. And journalists I spoke to said that they had to practice self-censorship. And by the time they had finished their time there, they were openly telling me that they just simply wouldn't even think to pitch stories, let alone try to publish stories that they knew wouldn't get printed by their bosses. So they didn't waste their time trying to present the country in a more positive or, frankly, more neutral light. So this is the sort of thing I was uncovering in the book, and that's why it's called Fake News and Misreporting. The 20 Years of Fake News and Misreporting is the subheadline of the book, and that's exactly what I found. The same thing can apply to so many countries in the world, any country that's the target of United States regime change operations, including Cuba, Iran, North Korea. The list is pretty long in terms of countries that are wildly distorted by the Western press. Of course, that doesn't mean everything's perfect about the place, but unfortunately, the media and the governments of our countries are not interested in giving us a nuanced view about these countries so that we can inform our own opinions. They're only interested in manufacturing public consent for whatever their outlooks and plans are for those countries. And that is generally regime change.
Yeah, so you've talked about journalists and the media more broadly, but you also in your book talk about the role of think tanks. For example, the Brookings Institute, the Heritage Foundation. You have some interesting information about, who funds them and their kind of mission. as it were, and their contribution, along with the journalists and media more broadly, in pursuing US foreign policy, including regime change programs, which are euphemistically called democracy promotion programs. So can you give us any specific examples of how these entities or interests interact and collaborate in relation to Venezuela and, as obviously we're Cuba Analysis in relation to Cuba, which is something that we know you've looked at and we'll get onto later?
Yeah, sure. Just a note on even the phrase democracy promotion is interesting. When you look at the National Endowment for Democracy, which is the big democracy promotion organization of the US government, which, just as an aside, was set up by the Reagan administration as an open front for the CIA, but we might get back to that in another time. That organization doesn't work in countries like Saudi Arabia or the United Arab Emirates or Bahrain, even though those are totalitarian dictatorships. When you look at where they do operate, it's countries that are targets for Washington's regime change ambitions, like Belarus or China or Venezuela, Nicaragua, Cuba, etc. So, when they talk about democracy, what they really mean is United States interest. We live in a deeply unequal society, and the reality is that there aren't many places where journalistic outlets or think tanks can get money. Generally, the two sources are the corporate world, or the government. And there are all sorts of think tanks developed who offer opinions on the situation in Latin America. You were talking about the Brookings Institute. There's others like the Heritage Foundation and the Carnegie Foundation. These think tanks are populated by Venezuelans, Cubans who have moved to the United States and who are absolutely antithetical to everything that has happened in the Venezuelan example since 1998, or in the Cuban example since 1959. They are completely recalcitrant in their opposition, but they have access to the money that the think tanks give them to provide reports which say whatever they want them to say, which is, in the Venezuelan and Cuban examples, overwhelmingly negative. The think tanks really provide an important base for manufacturing consent and pushing certain narratives into the public reign. What I mean by that is think tanks are populated by right-wing academics, quite reactionary people who are given a platform and money in order to produce reports saying all sorts of things about Venezuela or Cuba, that it's a massive, drugs producing country, that the economy is completely shot, that, something has to be done about the terrible human rights state in these countries. And that builds the framework that the media can then use as a crutch to support their arguments. And then governments themselves will take experts, so-called, from these think tanks and put them into their government to advise government policy. So the think tanks in the United States provide a really important piece of the jigsaw when we're talking about regime change, whether that's Cuba, whether that's Venezuela, or whether that's any other country abroad as well.
So you point out the US government has been attempting to overthrow Venezuela's Bolivarian government, first Chavez and then Maduro, since 1999. So again, I have a couple of questions on that. Can you tell me a little bit about those tactics? Was there any truth in the accusation that President Maduro was head of a drug cartel? And in what way does the sword history provide the context for the 3rd of January military attacks on Venezuela, which just happened, when the US forces bombed Caracas and 3 other Venezuelan states, killing 100 people, including 32 Cubans, and abducting the Venezuelan president and his wife? There's a lot in that.
Yeah, I mean, wow, those are, I guess you could write an entire PhD thesis about each of those questions. Maybe I'll just take the first one to begin with. How has the United States been attempting to influence or infiltrate Venezuelan politics? I mean, the US has been absolutely central in the development of Venezuelan politics since 1998. Since the election of Hugo Chavez in 1998, the US has never really accepted it Of course, they participated in the 2002 coup against Hugo Chavez. On the day of the coup, Ambassador Charles Shapiro was at the headquarters of the coup in Caracas. US warships entered Venezuelan territory on the day and were sailing towards the remote island of La Orchilla, which is where Hugo Chavez was taken when he was kidnapped. We know that the US government had been flying the coup leaders back and forth to Washington for months for secret talks, that they had been plying them with money. We know from the cables that were released under the Freedom of Information Act that the US ambassador and certain groups in Washington had been conversing and collaborating very closely with the coup leaders. And this coup was such an open secret in the US that there were actually there were actually questions in the Senate talking about just trying to get reassurances from the US government that they weren't going to support any upcoming coup. So everybody knew about what was going on, and we now have the documents to prove that the US was indeed involved. The coup leaders were supported financially by the NED and by USAID, two groups that are essentially US government groups that fund regime change operations around the world. After the coup failed, NED and USAID funding to groups that carried out the coup actually increased and then increased again. So to the point where it actually increased 16-fold. The US participated and supported an oil strike by the then semi-nationalized oil company PDVSA, which after the oil strike was properly nationalized, which really changed the course of Venezuelan history. The amount of money that the US government has pumped into local opposition forces in Venezuela is truly staggering. I mean, just USAID in the past 5 years alone has put more than $213 million into Venezuelan opposition groups, whether they're unions, whether they're social groups, political parties, NGOs, human rights organizations. That sort of money goes an awful long way inside a poor country like Venezuela, to the point where I think it's completely fair to say that there isn't a single sector of the opposition who hasn't been tainted by United States money. It's actually very difficult for people in the what we would call sort of moderate Venezuelan opposition to participate in politics without knowing that they are participating in regime change politics, because that is where the money comes from. The United States has been funding local Venezuelan media, funding civil society activists, funding journalists, etc. They supported various attempts by the opposition to put pressure on the government to overthrow the government, like the awful guarimbas, these street barricades which lasted for years in the 2010s, which killed dozens of people. Under the Obama administration, they really started to turn the screw with a campaign of economic warfare against Venezuela. If you're unaware and you live in the United States, you've actually been living under a national emergency since 2015, which was called by Obama about the severe and unusual threat that Venezuela poses to the national security of the United States. Now, if you're living in, New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, Texas, anywhere really, you might be surprised to know that you're living under a state of emergency, but that's what's been going on, and that's the legal justification in the United States for this campaign of brutal economic warfare, which has quite frankly destroyed the Venezuelan economy. There was one economist that did a study that showed that Venezuela lost 99% of its foreign income due to the economic warfare, particularly the blockade on Venezuela's oil industry. This economic warfare was only turned up to 11 under Donald Trump, who also, the Trump administration participated in a 2018 assassination attempt against Nicolas Maduro, which involved the use of drones. There have been campaigns of terror against the United States. We know from numerous people in the first Trump administration who published tell-all books, people like John Bolton, people like Mark Esper, the defense secretary, that Trump gave the go-ahead for campaigns of terrorism to go ahead. He actually wanted to invade Venezuela in his first term in office. He said it would be cool if the United States invaded Venezuela because it's, quote, really part of the United States, end quote. And these are not just things that were talked about. These are things that were actually put in practice. So not so long ago, a few years ago, a quote-unquote former CIA agent, Matthew John Heath, was arrested by Venezuelan authorities outside of the country's largest oil refining center with huge amounts of C4 explosives, guns, satellite radios, blocks of American dollars. And the media just completely ignored that story. Very few people even know his name. So there has been an enormous campaign in the United States to try to destabilize and overthrow the Venezuelan government. And that is really where the media come in, because the media, as I see it, when we look at the totality of what's going on, can only really be seen as an appendage of the United States government and the United States national security state. It has been their job to serve as the tip of the spear, the ideological justification for whatever the United States wants to do. They have gone in and monstered Venezuela, turned it into a joke, a pariah of a country in their eyes anyway. And that is really crucial groundwork that has to be laid for the United States if it wants to do any sort of regime change operation there. The American public would not accept a regime change operation against a country that they thought was doing fantastically in advancing human rights and was a model to follow. It has to be denigrated for years. And so the American public, particularly the liberal end of the spectrum, gets softened up to the idea of regime change. And that's why I really see them, as I said, as ideological foot soldiers in the battle against socialism. So I'll end by saying, before they send in the tanks, they send in the journalists. And, that's really the take-home message of my PhD and my book. What was that? I've forgotten your second question already.
There was a question about the veracity of the accusation that Maduro is the head of a drug cartel, or that Venezuela is a narco-state.
Well, you see this quite a lot in the media in the last couple of years, and it's emanating again from the Trump administration. The Trump administration put a bounty on Maduro's head of several tens of millions of dollars, claimed he was the head of an organization called the Cartel de los Soles, the Cartel of the Suns. But if you speak to academics who are either Latin American experts or even academics who don't take much interest in Venezuela or Latin America, or just drug experts in general, they really scratch their heads at these accusations, because the reality is that even 10 minutes of research will disprove this claim. The first place you would go to understand world drugs would be the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, and their latest World Drugs Report, which they publish year after year, the 2025 edition. Do you want to guess how many times they mention Venezuela in all their copious reports? 0. Absolutely 0. That is because Venezuela is an extremely minor drugs producing country, and certainly perhaps even less drugs smuggling country. When you actually look at the UN's Office on Drug and Crime report, it will tell you that most of the drugs that are coming in to the United States from Latin America are coming in via the Pacific route, and they are specifically loaded onto ships in countries like Ecuador or Colombia and sent via the Pacific Ocean to the United States. And that's quite ironic, because until very recently, Colombia was probably the main US ally in the region. And the United States had poured billions into a phony war on drugs, where it gave the government and the paramilitaries huge amounts of money, weapons, whatever they needed to prosecute a war they called against drugs, but in my opinion, was really a front for a war against the population of Colombia. It's also ironic because the president of Ecuador right now, Mr. Noboa, is a very close ally of the Trump administration, and he comes from one of Colombia's richest families who made their money in the banana trade. And an investigation by a local outlet found huge amounts of drugs being sent all over the world, including to the United States, on Noboa family banana ships. And that's one of the main ways in which drugs actually get into the United States. But of course, that doesn't matter. The fact that, this guy's family is a gigantic drug smuggling cartel, that's just, shit just swept under the rug, because the reality is that this claim has everything to do with regime change and very little to do with drugs. And, if you look at the US Drug Enforcement Agency's own threat assessment reports, which are very similar to the UN Office on Drug and Crime reports, their latest report, the 2025 edition, basically agrees with the UN in every single aspect of it. In the 90-page document that they released recently, there's only 2 paragraphs that even mention Venezuela at all. And that's on a single page. It's in relation to Tren de Aragua, this criminal gang, which may or may not exist in the United States in any sort of real capacity. And the US DEA's own report, as I said, actually concedes. I'm going to just read a little bit from it. The Maduro regime probably does not have a policy of cooperating with Tren de Aragua and is not directing Tren de Aragua movement to operations in the United States. The intelligence community bases this judgment on Venezuelan law enforcement actions, demonstrating the regime treats Tren de Aragua as a threat, end quote. So, it also notes that the FBI agrees with this. So the accusation that Maduro is head of some sort of crime family pushing drugs around the world is a fever dream made up in Washington and not supported by any facts whatsoever.
Yeah. I mean, there are other examples. For in the 1990s, there's a CIA document which, has been exposed, which listed the most important drug traffickers and families in Colombia. And number 51 was Uribe, who subsequently became the president of Colombia and had a very close relationship as an ally of the US government. Also, we'll go on to talk about Marco Rubio, who has members of his own family who have also been convicted of drug trafficking. But we'll get on to him. I do want to shift the focus now from Venezuela to Cuba. On the 11th of July 2021, there were unprecedented nationwide violent protests that broke out in Cuba. They lasted a few hours. You wrote several important articles exposing how US regime change programs were attempting to create an internal opposition as part of this historic 2-track policy. On the one hand, use economic warfare to immiserate the population, create discontent, and then to use that discontent to foster an internal opposition with the objective of regime change. So the titles of your articles are pretty self-explanatory, and I'm just going to run through them because they give an idea of the range of programs. So it's Bay of Tweets, documents point to US hand in Cuba protests, how the US government stokes racial tension in Cuba and around the world, private Facebook group that organized the July protests in Cuba plans bigger ones, and so on. The United States is organizing a color revolution in Cuba for November the 15th. That was the second follow-up protest, which in the end completely flopped. So can you tell us a bit about these programs? How are they similar to the ones used in Venezuela? Can we say that, actually they are they have been the sort of blueprint for the programs that were used in Venezuela? So, are these programs continuing? Is Cuba contending with that, as well as the oil scarcity, the oil blockade threatened by Trump, and the scarcities of food, fuel, and medicines in Cuba?
If you look at what happened with the protests in Cuba, if you were a Westerner on social media, or any sort of media really, if you were opening up your newspaper or watching your television, you were inundated with images of protests in Cuba, and you were probably thinking that this was the end of the government. The amount of people who came out to make public statements, from celebrities to politicians to influencers to all the way up to, the president himself, that were all urging people in Cuba to get on the streets and overthrow the government, you would have thought that this was an absolutely shocking thing where millions of people are out on the streets. And yet the images showed that there were only a few hundred people at max at some of these demonstrations in Havana. So the reality, so the image and reality could barely be more stark. And that's why I called it the Bay of Tweets, because there were certainly more tweets about the protests than there were protesters, which really suggests where this protest was actually manufactured. And if you look at the documents that you can find on the websites of places like the National Endowment for Democracy and USAID, you can find that, yes, indeed, these protests were manufactured in the United States and had been dreamed about for many years. The NED and CIA had organized and had been attempting to successfully infiltrate the Cuban hip-hop scene for more than 20 years, seeing music and art in general as a wedge and a way to drive counter-revolutionary ideas into Cuban society. So, for example, one project on the NED's website was called Empowering Cuban Hip-Hop Artists as Leaders in Society, and it stated that its goal was to, quote, promote citizen participation and social change, and to raise awareness about the role hip-hop artists have in strengthening democracy in Cuba, end quote. Of course, we know what democracy in Cuba means when the United States talks about it. It means regime change, because President Joe Biden himself said that the Cuban government is an authoritarian state and has meted out decades of repression. So we know what that entails, what democracy promotion entails in Cuba. And indeed, we did see this Cuban hip-hop artists try to lead these protests. When I say Cuban, I mean Cubans living in Miami. There were a section of relatively unknown Cuban artists who supported the protests, but the amount of people on the streets in Miami actually dwarfed the amount of people in the streets in Cuba. So there were millions of dollars worth of grants that were given to these local artist groups in order to try to push forward a regime change narrative. One of the main rappers, perhaps the face of these protests, was Yotuel, a Cuban rapper who lives in the United States, and his anthem Patria y Vida was played constantly and even shared, I believe, on the social media of President Biden himself, which really gives you an idea about who his real support base is. It's not, ordinary Cuban people. And to this day, you can find so many programs on the NED and on USAID's website talking about how they are supporting activist groups in Cuba to raise awareness of certain issues and certain cultural things. The United States government supports media in Cuba, media that targets Cuba, think tanks, academics, NGOs, social group, basically the entire spectrum of political life is targeted in countries like Venezuela and Cuba. And that goes on absolutely to this day. And it's really a tactic of psychological warfare to infiltrate these countries with anti-government messaging. They've also tried to create a wedge issue around race, as I wrote, how the US government stokes racial tensions in Cuba and around the world. There are, of course, racial problems in Cuba. Just because you have a revolution, it doesn't mean you automatically erase hundreds of years of slavery and inequality from an island. And actually, in the 1990s, Cuban hip-hop artists were raising these kinds of issues that were often, not very talked about too much in Cuban polite society. And the United States government saw that and thought, this is a fantastic wedge issue with which we can try to split Cuban society. And so we saw huge amounts of people in the United States, all of these sort of professional these professional talking heads and NGO types that came out and said, we have to support all these Cuban protests because these are Black people protesting against the awful racism of the Cuban government. Even though, just weeks before you could probably find them talking about how Black Lives Matter was an awful group and how, we shouldn't be inflaming tensions by protesting the death of George Floyd or anything. And, to their credit, Black Lives Matter in the United States saw this as a completely blatant regime change operation and refused to go along with it. And the leadership of the organization put out a statement expressing their solidarity with the Cuban Revolution. And that was really something that kind of ended this kind of specific attempt to drive race as a wedge issue in Cuba and try to push this protest movement going forward. Ultimately, they weren't able to translate their enormous amounts of money and their enormous amounts of influence in the media and in social media and within polite Western society into boots on the ground in Cuba. And they also weren't able to pull the wool over the radical Black activists in the United States either. So ultimately, these regime change projects failed, but they have new ones through the pipeline all the time. To take a quote from Irish Republicans talking about Margaret Thatcher, the United States government only has to be successful in one of these regime change operations. It doesn't matter if they fail with all the other ones. It just has to be successful once.
So just for the next question, communications from the Trump administration concerning Cuba and Venezuela are constantly confusing. They're often contradictory. Is it fair to describe this as a tactic, a psychological warfare, as you describe? What is that objective, and what is the impact of a psychological warfare? You say no boots on the ground, but what does this do to a nation and the opinion about them?
Well, I think when it comes to Trump's contradictory opinions, it might just be, frankly, a result of what his blood sugar levels are like at any point. I'm not really sure this mercurial character knows entirely what's going on. So, he seems to change policy on the fly daily based on who he's been speaking to. Definitely, though, the United States is absolutely carrying out a practice of psychological warfare against the Cuban government. That's what all of these, public statements talking about how, the end is nigh or how the Cuban people have to rise up, etc., is all about. It's similar to all sorts of statements put out about foreign countries all over the world. I'm reminded, for example, of what Mike Pompeo recently tweeted out about the Iranian protests. He said, good luck to all the people in Iran protesting their government. We've got Mossad agents among you who are walking among you who are going to be directing you. Why is he saying that if not as a tactic of psychological warfare? Or why did John Bolton let himself be photographed with a with a notebook that just said 5,000 troops to Colombia? Why was he allowing himself to be photographed with that in the context of a Venezuelan regime change operation? So yeah, of course they put out all of these things in order to confuse, scare, terrify the people and the governments in these countries. In Venezuela, they really put maximum pressure on in late 2025 and early 2026 in an attempt to try to get, I assume, to get the military to crack and to cause fissures within the government. Seems that they haven't been able to do that, and then they simply came in and just kidnapped the president in an act of blatant warfare that will go down in history as one of the most shocking and blatant violations of international law. But the warfare against countries like Cuba takes many, there are many prongs to it. There's psychological, there's media, there's economic, there's political, and sometimes there's even military warfare. So this is really just one one arrow in the quiver of the United States, and they're using it constantly against countries they don't like, especially countries in Latin America.
What about the role of the opposition leaders in this propaganda war and regime change program? So I'm thinking Venezuelan opposition leader Maria Corina Machado, and for Cuba, we might look at the right-wing Cuban and so-called Cuban American politicians, some who have not even visited Cuba. Marco Rubio, who of course has the very powerful position of Secretary of State. Maria Elvira Salazar, who's a US congressional representative for Florida. What about their role in all of this? And also, are you aware of a relationship between those particular sectors in Venezuela and Cuba?
Yeah, absolutely. Just on the first question, the Venezuelan and Cuban opposition, it's very difficult to even talk about them as separate entities because most of these, well, not most, but a very large chunk of them live in the same milieu in southern Florida, in Miami. We used to talk about the Cuban American community a lot in the 80s, 90s, and how it drove American policy. But now I think we really have to talk about the Cuban Venezuelan community in southern Florida, because there are millions of these people. A lot of these people also receive government money from, for their media outlets, for their think tanks, etc. And these people are fundamentally intertwined. What they want for Cuba is exactly the same as what they want for Venezuela. You talked about Maria Corina Machado. She is, if people aren't aware, she's basically, I would say she's probably the most important opposition figure in Venezuela right now. She's got a very interesting political career. She was involved in the 2002 coup, which I talked about earlier. She signed the infamous Carmona Decree, which fired every single elected official in Venezuela. It handed over the country to Pedro Carmona, who was basically the Donald Trump of the United States. He was the chairman of the Venezuelan Chamber of Congress. It even changed the name of the country, for God's sake. So that was Machado's first foray into public life. That was the first time that she really became known as a figure in Venezuela. She then, amazingly, tried to rebrand herself as a democracy activist, starting an election monitoring organization called Sumate. Now, Sumate was started and received funding from the National Endowment for Democracy, which, as I said before, is a CIA front. And her work could not have been carried out in the way it was without copious amounts of funding from Washington. She represents the most radical strain of opposition in Venezuela. There are much more conciliatory, much more loyal opposition, more moderate opposition forces in Venezuela. But Machado has always represented the far right in that sense. If you look at her political policy positions, which she doesn't talk about much, but if you actually look at her proposals, it basically looks as a absolutely whole-scale privatization of the economy. In a recent podcast with Donald Trump's son, she talked about how she was going to, quote, privatize everything, end quote. And then she said absolutely blatantly to Trump's son, you are going to make a lot of money out of this. So what she wants is a sort of General Pinochet-style fire sale of Venezuela's state assets, Venezuela's public assets, selling them off to the highest bidder in the United States or Europe. I mentioned General Pinochet. She's also very much a supporter of violence in order to get there. She has generally abstained from participating in elections, preferring a more direct route. She was one of the faces of the 2014 Guarimba campaign, which was an attempt to overthrow the government via a campaign of terror. A lot of things that happened in the Guarimba included the bombing of hospitals, the bombing of schools, kindergartens, the Caracas metro, There were huge amounts of barricades set up all over the city. Razor wire was planted across roads in order to behead and garrote passing motorcyclists. Some of the guerillas also went after Afro-Venezuelans, dousing them in petrol and burning them alive on camera in order to send a message to the government and to the people of Venezuela. Their tactics were basically very ISIS-style tactics in the sense that they were trying to terrify the country into submitting to their rule. Now, that didn't work, but it did leave a deep scar on Venezuelan politics. And up until very recently, she was definitely the most popular and most powerful driving force within the Venezuelan opposition. I spent a lot of time in Venezuela in 2024, including at the elections they had in July. And even though Machado was banned from participating because she had spent the previous 2-3 years roaming the entire globe, including places like Panama, the OAS, trying to drum up support for sanctions against the country and trying to drum up support for foreign military operation against Venezuela. She was still very popular. If you talked to Venezuelans, and I often ask them, are you voting for Maduro? Are you voting for Edmundo Gonzalez, the main opposition figure? They would say, no, I am voting for Maria. And what they meant was they knew that Edmundo Gonzalez, this decrepit, octogenarian politician who had retired some 22 years previously, was actually just a stand-in for Machado because she had been technically barred from running. Everybody said, I'm voting for Maria, I'm voting for Maria. They didn't say, I'm voting for Edmundo. That was who the opposition was putting their eggs in. That was their basket, that was their leader. However, in the past few weeks, she has really overplayed her hand, and she has seen her public support drop from, relatively high, 20, 30, 40% of Venezuelan supporter to the single digits. And that's because she has completely signed, number one, she was completely blatant with the Trump administration about what she was going to do. And number two, she enthusiastically supported the US operation against President Maduro, which saw US aircraft invade Venezuelan territory, bomb the capital, Caracas, kill over 100 people, including, I believe, 32 Cuban security officials, and kidnap the sitting president of the country. And Venezuelan people, while many of them dislike Maduro and dislike the government, that doesn't translate into wanting their head of state kidnapped and for them to be directly ruled by the United States, which is what the Trump administration has in plan for them. Another thing which has created a little bit of tension in Venezuela is Machado's open support for Israel and its genocide against Palestine. A few years ago, she wrote a letter to Benjamin Netanyahu asking for an Israeli foreign military operation, a humanitarian intervention, as she called it, in Venezuela. She wanted the IDF troops on the ground to overthrow the government of Nicolas Maduro. She also, her Vente Venezuela party, signed a formal partnership deal with Netanyahu's Likud party recently, which sees them cooperate on all sorts of political, economic, and ideological issues, which has again really caused a lot of controversy in Venezuela. When Maduro went to the polls, he shouted, "Long live free Palestine," and as he was putting his ballot in the ballot box. Whereas Machado says that, Israel's struggle is our struggle. And that's why you see Israeli flags at her rallies, which were never particularly large in Venezuela compared to the government's ones, but certainly had more people. And in recent weeks, it seems that Machado's public support has really dwindled. So it remains to be seen whether she can rekindle her public support. One place that she does have total support from is the White House and the presidency of Donald Trump and his Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, though. Trump, of course, seems to be very annoyed that Machado was given the Nobel Peace Prize and he didn't. And so Machado formally tried to give that Peace Prize over to Trump in order to, sweet talk him into supporting a bid for her to be ensconced in the Miraflores presidential palace in Caracas. Trump hasn't signed off on that yet, but it remains to be seen whether there might be some sort of crazy military operation to try to not just cut the head off the snake, but try to destroy the entire Venezuelan government and place Machado in there as a dictator. Rubio, of course, a Cuban American, has had his eyes set on regime change in Venezuela and Cuba for a long time, and it's been one of his driving goals in his entire political career. Really, he's been talking about this for decades. He's managed to work his way up to Secretary of State. He is really in the running to be the president one day in the not too distant future, and he will make regime change and the cementing of American power over the continent he calls America's backyard to be one of his most important and one of his most important policy goals. As we were talking about earlier, or as you alluded to earlier, Rubio has his own narcotics background. His own brother-in-law was found and prosecuted and sentenced to more than 10 years in prison for his role in being a cocaine kingpin in the 1980s. And when he was actually arrested, Rubio himself was living with his brother-in-law at the time, leading to many questions about whether he was involved in any way in this huge cocaine operation that his brother-in-law was running. He remains to this day close to his brother-in-law. He put pressure on Florida lawmakers to grant his brother-in-law a real estate license. And that's one of the many reasons why people inside Venezuela and Cuba indeed often call him Narco Rubio, which, I think is a pretty good summation of his politics.
So, staying in the United States, how should we understand US foreign policy under the Trump administration and in the broader geopolitical terms? And that's especially in the relation now to the growing domestic upheaval.
Well, I guess one of the only good things I'll say about the Trump administration and Trump generally is he says the quiet part out loud. There's really no pretense about what he's doing here. Trump pulls back the curtain and reveals the naked face of the American empire. It's always been like this, but when presidents like Clinton and Obama and Bush were in power, there was much more of a polished veneer. They would talk about human rights and humanitarian interventions. Trump talks about, going in there and stealing the oil. That's always been American policy. Trump just says it out loud. However, Trump does seem to have been pivoting American foreign policy away from sort of full spectrum dominance and the ideas of the Clinton administration in the 90s, realizing that perhaps China and to a lesser extent Russia cannot just be simply overthrown and they have to be dealt with as major powers. It seems the United States is pulling out somewhat from their role in Asia and concentrating more on, as I said, the region that they call America's backyard. And there's been an increased focus on trying to overthrow governments that they don't like in Latin America, particularly in Cuba and Venezuela, but also to a certain extent in Nicaragua. Trump has said that Gustavo Petro, the president of Colombia, is also high up on his list, and he might just do a little military intervention in Bogota as well. So we are living through interesting times. We are living through a change somewhat in US policy, not in their goals, but certainly in their tactics. And that means that we are living in very, very dangerous times for revolutionaries, for leftists living in Latin America. And we have to be very clear about what's going on, analyze the situation, and come up with strategies to prevent or counter it.
Yeah, well, that leads perfect into my next question, because what can we normal people, solidarity activists, and anyone, in fact, who's listening to this podcast, to do to counter fake news and misreporting, which only serves imperial interests while alienating people from societies that are struggling, or those who are trying to build alternative societies which prioritize people before profit.
I guess on an individual level, it's very hard to do much that is actually going to change anything. I guess on an individual level, you can point out biases, you can talk to people, you can engage with your friends, your neighbors, etc. But it's important, in fact, it's imperative to actually work together, to join societies, to join organizations that will become stronger because of that can collectively act, can collectively negotiate, can collectively organize to build up the sort of knowledge base of our countries and to build up the solidarity with Latin American countries to try to give people a different framework, a much more accurate framework of understanding this important region of the world. So I guess on the short term, you can point things out, you can write letters, you can tweet, you can do all of this, but that's going to have a very sort of short-term impact on anything you can do. The much more long-term impact is to try to start building alternatives through organizations, through political parties, through traveling yourself, through building up all these links that are going to be very important in countering media bias and the guerra mediática against Latin America. And I think on a longer term level, I think we also have to talk about withdrawing our trust and our eyeballs from mainstream corporate news sources and trying to build alternative news organizations as well. News organizations that will not only cover Latin America better, but also cover our own countries in a far more neutral and balanced manner, and in a manner that will actually empower ordinary people to take back control of their lives. So I guess the very long-term strategy of this would be to organize a revolution in our own countries to try to build things better in here, because ultimately these revolutions in Latin America can survive somewhat on their own, but they can't thrive. They need to have links with other countries, other like-minded governments around the world. So I guess I would say we start having to build governments in our own countries that can do similar things to what they've managed to achieve in Latin America already.
Yeah, that's a fantastic way to end. So, I mean, say what you're saying really leads me to kind of thank you for the work that you're doing. You're one of a small group of investigative journalists, and I should say anti-imperialists as well, who are really doing the footwork that other people can use to inform themselves, to get organized, to as you say, form the first of all, the very powerful notion that there is an alternative that's possible, and recognize the links between the roles of our own government, our own oppression, and the imperialist oppression overseas, whether it's Latin America, Africa, Asia, or elsewhere. So go on. Yeah.
Well, I thank you very much for saying that. And I just want to throw it back to you to say that, academic work is absolutely crucial in this as well. Journalists can reach a wider audience and, push and dispel and disperse information that's important for the public to know. But ultimately, it is kind of a shallow understanding, and we rely crucially on academics that have that deep understanding of these places, that put in the enormous amount of work that is necessary to actually, read all the documents, keep up to date with everything. And, your books are absolutely crucial to journalists, and your knowledge is crucial to journalists, your expertise, in order that we can bring that to the wider public as well.
So, hopefully the audience will be inspired by the conversation and share this podcast and what we've learned from Alan today about propaganda, fake news and misrepresentation. Thank you, Alan, so much for coming on to Cuba Analysis Podcast. And we will continue to benefit from reading your investigative journalist work and the important and principled work that you're doing. So thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much for starting your own podcast. And this is crucial work as well. Thank you.